Thank you so much all for coming. My name is Avi Moorthy. I'm a PhD student here in the Public Policy program. And I'm excited to present this work, which actually came directly out of the Stone Pro seminar. So the project's called The Defender on the Move, Black Newspapers and the Great Migration. So the project's motivated by a puzzle in American history, which is that following the end of slavery in the United States, conditions for Black Americans in the US were a lot better in the northern US than they were in the South under Jim Crow laws. So these images here illustrate some of these differences between North and South in this time period. The image on the left shows a schoolhouse for Black children in Greene County, Georgia, whereas the image on the right shows the library of the integrated Robert Lindblom High School in Chicago. To put some numbers to these images, Black Southerners in the early 1900s received roughly half as much schooling and annual income as their northern counterparts, and had a 20% higher premature mortality rate. Now, since Larry Shosted's seminal work, labor economists have modeled migration as a mechanism to correct these sorts of geographic disparities. But for almost 50 years, there was almost no migration north taking place. And in fact, in 1910, around 90% of the US Black population remained in the South. Now, Black Southerners faced many barriers to migrate north, including the cost of a train ticket and uprooting one's family, as well as barriers that were imposed upon them by an oppressive Southern white community and economy that relied on Black labor and keeping workers in the South. But despite these barriers from 1910 to 1940, a stunning reversal took place, and around 1.5 million Black Southerners moved north. So this was known as the First Great Migration. This is one of the largest movements of people and moves to opportunity in history. These first migrants and the patterns of chain migration that they would set in motion would go on to reshape the US, especially northern cities in the US, into the way they look present day. A nice example here is that in 1910, only 2% of Chicago's population was Black. By 1930, this had already increased to about 7%. But despite the transformative nature of the Great Migration, we know relatively little about the origins of this event, and in particular, after this delay of almost 50 years, what enabled the first migrants to head north? Understanding this question is important to help us understand similar contexts present day in which large returns to migration may go unrealized. So in this paper, I first documented that Black Southerners in the early 1900s faced extremely high information frictions about northern conditions. I then showed how a partnership between the Chicago Defender, which is the largest Black newspaper in the northern US, and a group of Southern Black railway porters who worked for the Illinois Central Railroad, managed to lower these information frictions, enabling both migration north as well as social change in the South. In the words of Timuel Black, who was a civil rights activist and migrant from Alabama, they weren't just selling a newspaper, they were informing the people of a better world. So specifically in this paper, I estimate the causal effect of information about northern life and jobs on Black migration north and Southern activism. And so my main approach to do so will use individual level of variation within cities and how close individuals lived to a railway porter who would have sold a Chicago Defender. So intuitively here we're comparing the migration decisions of similar individuals in the same city, one of whom happened to live near a porter who carried information about the North, and another who lived further away. I also complement this with a difference in differences approach across counties, where I'll compare outcomes for counties with or without access to the Defender. My main result is going to be that access to information was a major determinant of who migrated north. I found that individuals who lived near a porter in 1910 were 3 percentage points, or 33%, more likely to migrate north by 1920 than similar individuals in the same city who lived further away. And I'll tell you what this means later in the talk. And I'll also show you these individuals are more likely to move to cities that received more coverage in Defender articles and job ads. And I'll show you how information then spilled across social networks, so information spreading both across space as well as through family ties. Finally, at the end, I'll provide some more suggestive evidence that information and subsequent migration flows helped spark Southern activism, where I find that counties with access to the Defender were more likely to form a branch of the NAACP, which is the oldest civil rights organization in the US, and experience a large reduction in the incidence of racial violence. So in doing so, I contribute to growing work that looks at the Great Migration. So while we have a lot of evidence on how the migration impacted northern cities, causing white flight to suburbia and the rise of Black inner cities, we know less about the origins and the individual level drivers of these first migrants' decisions. And while existing work mentions the role of push and pull factors, such as the First World War, the ball-weevil cotton infestation, and the incidence of violence, these factors would have still required information to increase Black migration. I also contribute to work studying the social and economic effects of information in the media. So we have growing evidence and perhaps intuition that people tend to move to places where they know other people. But we know less about, in the absence of these existing social ties, what establishes these patterns of chain migration. And I'll talk about the role of information in guiding these moves to opportunity. Finally, I show information spreads both geographically and across family ties, contributing to work on social networks. So I want to start by documenting what information looked like in the South, and what the Chicago Defender's unique role was. So the first point I want to make is just that Black Southerners in the early 1900s faced extremely high information frictions. In part, these frictions were due to a lack of Northern ties or connectedness. So for instance, in 1910, only 2% of individuals would have had a former household member living in the North. The other part was a deliberate attempt by the white community of the South to restrict the flow of information from the North as well as its circulation within the South. So for instance, white employers would often misrepresent Northern conditions, warning of inhospitable Northern winters. And white officials took it a step even further by imposing fines and arrests to deter Northern employers from coming to the South to recruit Southern workers. So a letter from a Black individual in Miami, Florida, summarizes this mystery of the North nicely. It reads, "It was a rumor about the great work going on in the North, but at the present time, people are saying that all we've been hearing was false." So the entry of the Chicago Defender managed to lower these frictions. And so to give an example of what this difference in information and coverage looked like, these clippings here contrast the Defender's coverage of migration north with that of the Savannah Tribune, which was actually a Black newspaper located in Savannah, Georgia. So while the Savannah Tribune here warns of the risk of arrest moving north and actually refers to migration as immigration despite it being the same country, the Defender cartoon here on the left is much more effusive in its praise of migration. This clipping reads that bees will not stay in places that are not fit to live in. So a broader challenge and question is how to classify what information was conveyed in this time period. And so what did the Chicago Defender provide? And so to tackle this, I applied large language models to classify the sentiment and topics covered in thousands of issues of Southern newspapers in the Chicago Defender in the 1910s. And so I first showed that white newspapers in the South pretty much ignored the Black community altogether. Only about 2% of articles in these newspapers would have even mentioned a Black individual. And when they were mentioned, the sentiment was overwhelmingly negative. So nearly 60% were in the context of crime or death. So instead, Black Southerners had to rely on small and financially precarious local Black newspapers. And so the key takeaway from this figure here is that these newspapers were overwhelmingly local in their coverage, rarely covering news from the North, or for that matter, from the rest of the South. So readers of these papers were exposed to a very concentrated set of information. The Defender, in the meanwhile, operating from the relative safety of Chicago in the North, was able to both document and criticize oppression in the South and provide a window into the opportunities available to Black Northerners with full pages on news, sports, entertainment, and ads for jobs and housing in Chicago and other northern cities. And this actually shows up in hundreds of letters of Southern Chicago Defender readers who mention descriptions of Chicago and job ads as motivation to migrate north. And so by entering the South here, the Defender was able to both maximize reach a large Black community without access to reliable information, as well as maximize its potential readership. So making it the largest Black newspaper in the US, selling more copies than its competitors combined, and making its founder, Robert Abbott, one of the first Black millionaires in the US. So to reach Southern readers, the Chicago Defender around the mid-1910s began partnering with Black railway porters who worked for the Illinois Central Railroad. So these were individuals who were employed by the Pullman Company to carry bags, shine shoes, set up beds, and serve food on sleeping rail cars across the US. And so the Defender in particular, around the mid-1910s, began partnering with porters who worked for the Illinois Central Railroad. So these porters lived in southern cities located along the railroad and traveled back and forth between their homes in the South and Chicago, where they started purchasing copies of the Defender at bulk rates, and then to supplement their wages on the railroad, they were selling them to their friends and neighbors back home in the South. Once in the South, these copies were then shared and communally read in Black churches and barbershops, allowing the newspaper to reach hundreds and thousands of Black Southerners, including those who may not be able to read at the time. So adult literacy at this point was nearly 80% in cities. So to measure the effects of information on Black migration north, I link individuals across the 1910 and 1920 censuses using crosswalks from the Census Tree database. And my primary sample will be the 35 southern cities located along the Illinois Central Railroad, where porters would have sold the Chicago Defender. So this map here shows the railroad, which stretches south from Chicago to New Orleans and southeast to Savannah, Georgia. And so in these cities along the railroad, I'll estimate the relationship between individuals' residential proximity to a porter and northern migration. So the treatment here is both likely access to the Chicago Defender, as well as contact with a porter who had ties to northern cities, could help interpret the newspaper's coverage and guide the journey north. And so in the census, I'm able to identify railway porters using their occupation and industry code. So I want to note that I can't distinguish Illinois Central porters from porters working on other railroads in these cities. So in equation form, this looks like this. So my outcome is an indicator variable for whether individual I, who lived in an Illinois Central city in 1910, migrated north by 1920. And the key predictor is going to be individual I's log number of households from their nearest porter in 1910. So I'm measuring this as a difference in census enumeration order between the household of individual I and the household of their nearest porter. So here I'm using the fact that until 1960, census enumerators used to go door to door surveying households in the order in which they're physically situated. And so this correlates strongly with Euclidean distance in meters or miles as the crow flies. This is because of a much larger sample size due to geocoding rates of under 50%. So to give you a sense of what this variation looks like, this map here for geocoded addresses plots in gray the black population of Memphis, Tennessee in 1910, which was an Illinois central city. And highlighted in black here are the porters of Memphis who would have likely sold the Chicago Defender. And so what's, I think, unique with this setting is that in a desaturated information environment, it'll say who likely had access to information about the North and how information might have spread, where individuals who lived near these porters had more exposure than individuals who lived further away. So ultimately, the variation is actually going to be even more local, as we'll be looking within neighborhoods. So this image here shows an image from a page from the 1910 census, again, in Memphis. So each row here represents an individual who was enumerated in the census. Highlighted in red here is the enumeration of D. Mason, who was a railway porter in Memphis who likely would have sold the Chicago Defender. So then highlighted in yellow are the individuals I'm able to link to the 1920 census. So we can do this for about 40% of individuals in my sample. And then highlighted in blue here are the individuals who lived near D. Mason, who likely had access to the Defender, who then migrated north by 1920. So I want to focus on this first rectangle up here, which is the family of James Copeland. So James was a street paver in Memphis, where he lived with his wife, Effie, and his son, James Jr. So now if we turn to the 1920 census and move to Chicago, we once again see James Copeland and his family. So James is now working as a laborer in the stockyards, which was an occupation with a 40% higher income than his old job in Memphis. He's once again joined by his wife, Effie, and his son, James Jr. They've since had 2 more kids now, Johnny and George Copeland. So the key identifying assumption for this approach to be empirically valid is that living near an Illinois central porter should have been as good as random with respect to an individual's likelihood of migrating north. And so the concern here might be that individuals who live near porters were more likely to migrate north even in the absence of information. So my main approach to test this will be to predict for each individual their likelihood of migrating north using 1910 census characteristics. And so I use the following characteristics here. And what's nice is you can predict migration really well on average using these census attributes. And so the key test will be to follow some of Raj Chetty's work by regressing these predicted likelihoods and how close individuals live to a porter. As additional tests, I can also look at the effects of living near individuals with similar characteristics to porters, as well as porters who could not have sold the Chicago Defender. So turning to my results, so this first figure here is going to test this assumption. So this plots the relationship between individuals' log number of households from a porter in 1910 and this predicted likelihood of migrating based on census characteristics. And so the key takeaway from this figure here is that living near a porter appears to be uncorrelated with this predicted likelihood. So proximity to a porter seems to have been as good as random with respect to the observables that likely predict migration. So then overlaid in black here represents my main results. So this is the effect of living near a porter in 1910 on observed migration by 1920. And so the key takeaway here is that access to information appears to be a major determinant of who migrated north. Find that individuals who lived within a couple of households of a porter in 1910, so those are these guys right here, were at roughly 3 percentage points or 33% more likely to migrate north by 1920 than individuals in the same city lived about a half mile away. So those are these guys right here. So again, the treatment here is both likely access to the Chicago Defender as well as contact with a porter who had northern ties. But if we look at the effects of living near a porter in cities along other north-south railroads or in the decade before the partnership began, we see much weaker effects, which is consistent with both information and its dissemination mattering. So next I look at heterogeneity and where these individuals who live near a porter and would have migrated to. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, the largest effect is on migration to Chicago. So the Chicago effect is about half of the overall effect size and is larger than the effect of the other 9 largest northern cities combined. Interestingly, we see no effects on migration to other cities located along the Illinois Central Railroad or to cities located nearby to Chicago, where moving costs would have been similar. But instead, I also see increased migration to Philadelphia, New York, and Los Angeles. And so this could be reflecting the Defender's coverage of these cities. Indeed, that seems to be what's going on. So if we use mentions in the Chicago Defender, again, using large language models to identify coverage, we once again see that individuals who live near a porter were significantly more likely to migrate to cities that received high levels of coverage in the Chicago Defender. And these effects are pretty consistent across mentions in articles, classified ads for jobs and housing, and product ads. But I see no effects of living near a porter on migration to low coverage cities. And these results look the same if we residualize mentions in city size. So this isn't just capturing moving to big cities, but it appears to be disproportionate coverage of news as well as economic opportunity in the Chicago Defender. So beyond these direct effects of living near a porter and learning about the North, information may then spread through family ties, for instance, and influence the migration decisions of individuals who live further away. And so to test for these informational spillovers, I'm going to look at a specific type of spillover, which was from urban areas in the South, these Illinois central cities, to rural parts of the South. So the intuition here is that if I lived in a rural part of the South but had a relative move to an Illinois central city, they may have then told me about the opportunities available in the North. And in particular, where my relative moved in relation to a porter might have influenced how much information I had. So that's exactly what I find. So I find that rural individuals with a relative who moved within a couple households of a porter by 1910 were 1 percentage point, or 22%, more likely to migrate north by 1920 than individuals from the same rural county in the South who had a relative move a half mile away from a porter. So this is consistent with the story of individuals moving to cities, learning about northern opportunities, and pulling their relatives to migrate north with them. So this is kind of getting a sense of how these chain migration patterns may have begun. So finally, to incorporate these network and agglomeration effects, I turn to the county level, where I use the fact that some readers who bought copies from porters would later subscribe to the Chicago Defender and receive copies by mail. And so here I'm digitizing new data from a shipping manifest that lists the names and addresses of 1918 Defender mail subscribers. So this comes from a military intelligence division investigation into the Defender that was part of a broader post-war federal surveillance of Black leaders and organizations. So across counties, I'm going to use the presence of a subscriber as a proxy for the Defender servicing a county in 1918. And so I'll do a pretty standard difference in differences event study approach. So these results are going to be more suggestive, but I think they provide a nice insight into some of the broader patterns that might have been going on here. So this first figure here shows that counties with access to the Defender experienced a large reduction in their Black population share. So this is presumably because of outmigration. Next, I find that counties with access to the Defender were more likely to form a branch of the NAACP. So this is consistent with the Defender's coverage and promotion of the organization, as well as with increased, throughout migration, increased ties to a Black community in the North that voted and held office, as well as potentially with reduced white coercion in the South. So finally, I found that counties with access to the Defender experienced a large and meaningful reduction in the incidence of lynchings, which were an extreme form of violence used by white mobs in the South to intimidate and extrajudicially police the Southern Black community. And so this decline in violence is consistent with reduced white coercion due to the threat of outmigration. So finally, to wrap up, you can do some back of the envelope calculations using this estimate to try and get a sense of how big these effects were. But I think what's important to remember is by focusing on these first migrants, the true effects will go on to be even larger as these individuals reach the North, told their families and friends about the opportunities in Chicago and other cities, starting these patterns of chain migration. Finally, taking a step back, my results suggest that reliable information delivered through trusted liaisons can help guide these moves to opportunity as well as empower local communities. This is like a nice parallel to this present day in the rise of community media, which seeks to try and provide a voice to communities that are often misrepresented or excluded from mainstream media, as well as the work of NGOs such as the Confess Project, which trains Black barbers as community mental health advocates. So a similar idea of using delivering an information treatment through community liaisons. But I think there's more work to be done to better understand how we can communicate information to vulnerable communities. And I'll stop there.